Now we've provisioned an Azure Data Factory instance in my Azure subscription, and I guess the first thing we want to do is to use that to actually transfer some data from one place to another. So let's take a look at a very simple way of transferring data using the copy wizard. So here's the Azure portal, and just to remind you, I have created an Azure Data Factory instance called ADF-12345, and I already had an Azure SQL database server called GSQL12345, which contains a database called DataDB, and I've got an Azure storage account called GStore12345. And there's various tools I can use to work with these services that I have running in my Azure subscription. Just to keep things simple for the demo, I'm going to use Visual Studio, but in the labs you might use some different tools. So let's take a look in Visual Studio, and I can see in my Cloud Explorer here all of those different things I've got. So I can see first of all that storage account. If I expand this, there's my GStore12345 storage account. And if I have a look at the blob containers that contains, I can see there's a blob container called ADF data. And if I have a look in that blob container, there's a folder called data, which contains a file called transactions.txt. Let's take a look at that. We'll just download that and look at it. And you can see that it just contains some simple data, a very small amount of data just for the purposes of the demo, where we have a date and an amount for transactions that have occurred on particular dates. So we've got that data. The other thing I've got is my Azure SQL database. So what we can actually see in my SQL databases here, we've got a database called DataDB. And I've already actually opened that up in the SQL Server Object Explorer here. So I can go ahead, we'll just close this window, we don't need that. And I can go and create a new query in that database. And I'm just going to use this to show that I currently have a table in here. So I have a table called dbo.transactions. And if I go ahead and run that query, we should see that that table consists of 3 columns, ID, tdate, and amount, but it currently doesn't have any data in it. We've got an empty table there ready for some data. And you can probably guess what we're going to do. We're going to try and transfer the data from our storage account into our database. So to do that, I'm going to use my Azure Data Factory. So let's go and take a look at that. And I'm going to use this copy data option here. So we'll look at copy data. That opens a new tab. And what we get is a wizard that I can use to copy data from one place to another. So it's going to ask for a name for the task that gets generated by this particular wizard. So I'll just call it copy wizard. And a description of what that task does. So copy data from store to SQL. Correct my typing. And I could choose to run this regularly on a schedule, and that's really the most common way of using Azure Data Factory when you need to repeatedly copy things. But just for the purpose of the demo, I'm just going to run this once now. And I'll set an expiration time after which it would give up. So if it hasn't completed it in 3 hours, it would stop. We'll go ahead and move to the next step. And it says, well, where's the source for this data? What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to a data store. And that data store is an Azure Blob Storage store. So we'll select that and click Next. And it asks for a name for this connection that I'm creating to my blob store. So we'll just call it blob store. And it's going to be from my Azure subscriptions. It's actually currently looking at all of my subscriptions. I could choose an individual subscription here if I want to. And it's identified, well, you've got a storage account called GStore12345. That's the one that I want. So we'll go ahead and select that and move on. And so now it's looking for, well, where's the data that you actually want to transfer? And I'm going to go into my ADF data container there, and I'll just select the data folder. I want to transfer all of the files. At the moment, there's only one file in there, but there could be multiple files. So we'll just select that folder, and we'll just say we want to choose that folder, and we want to copy the files across from there. Now, I could copy recursively. If I had subfolders, I could copy them as well, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to leave it as it is with its defaults. And it's going to go inspect that folder. It finds that it contains a file called transactions.txt, and it analyzes that file. So I can see it's looked at that. It's defaulting to a comma delimited with a carriage return line feed between the lines. And it's identified that the first data row seems to contain the headers. So you can see that it's actually giving me this preview of the data down here at the bottom, where it's identified the first row contains tdet and amount, and then it's got the actual data in rows underneath that. So it's read the file, it's identified that's what that file looks like, so that must be the schema. And if I take a look at the schema, you can see that it identifies the first row is containing date-time data, or the first column rather containing date-time data, and the second column containing double precision integers, or double precision decimals rather. So it's identified the data correctly. We could make changes here if we wanted to, but it seems to have got it right. We'll move to the next step. And now where do I want to copy that to? Well, I want to copy that to my Azure SQL database. So we'll select that type of data store. And we give this a name. So again, we'll just keep it easy. We'll just call it SQL database. And again, it's identifying from my Azure subscriptions that I've already got a server called GSQL12345, which has a database called DataDB. So that all looks right to me. We'll move on to the next step. Oh, there is an error on there. I haven't told it the username and password, of course. So we'll just type in the username and password that we need to connect to that. And then we're ready to go to the next step. So it's going to go and have a look, and it's mapping now the blob path, that data in my storage account, to a table in the database. So we choose the table. There's a number of tables to choose from. In this case, it's the transactions table that we looked at earlier, which is currently empty. And we'll just move to the next step. And it goes and it has a look at that table, and it figures out, well, you've got something in here called tdate in the source data, called tdate of date time, and you've got a column in the destination called tdate of date time. So that seems like a reasonable assumption that that's how we're going to map that. And the same with amount. We're mapping amount, which is a double in the source, to amount, which is a decimal in the destination. So it's figured out the mapping. If not, I could change that. I could go and change the mapping there. The repeatability settings, we're not actually going to perform a repeatable copy here, an idempotent copy, so we'll just leave that as none, and we'll go and click next. And then we get some advanced settings here. Really, this is to do with performance. It's how I do the job in parallel, but I'm just going to leave that at its defaults. We'll go ahead and click next, and it's now showing me this is what's going to happen. We're going to copy from the Azure Blob Storage across to the Azure SQL database, and we'll go ahead and finish the wizard and actually run that. So what it's going to go and do now is it's going to validate those environments, make sure everything's ready to go, create the connections that it needs to connect to those two different data sources, and we'll talk more about those later on. And then it's going to create something called a pipeline, which again we'll talk about in more detail later in this course. It's going to go off and create a pipeline to do that job, and when it's created that, it's then going to run the pipeline to copy the data from the source to the destination. We'll just leave that running. And when it's ready to go, it's going to go ahead and provision that pipeline and run the activities, in this case a copy activity to copy the data across. I could go and monitor that pipeline, but actually it's a fairly quick pipeline. We'll talk about monitoring later on. So I'm just going to go and have a look now at my destination table. This is my transactions table. Just go ahead and run that query once again. And eventually the copy operation has completed, and I can see that that data is now over here in my database. So I've successfully used the wizard to copy data from my Azure store across into my Azure SQL database.